you and the games are one.
When it comes to this idea of revolutionizing control, the usual driving force is to make something that's more comfortable, more ergonomic, something that's very intuitive. And a very classic concept for this, with a very infamous example, is the Power Glove, a controller that you can wield single-handedly and control a whole game with gestures alone. Now, the Power Glove is a very popular example of this, but it wasn't the last controller to do it. And in fact, we actually found a very weird option that came out later: the Reality Quest controller. This PlayStation controller is one of two models I was able to find that uses the Reality Quest name, the other one being an N64 design. And what's interesting about how it differentiates itself from the Power Glove is that it's not so much a glove really as it's more of a brace, a cast, or even just kind of a grip. The very basic concept of it is actually really interesting because it's not quite as ambitious in its design, but it's kind of smart at the same time. So you've got buttons here that your fingers are able to rest on for the main four front-facing ones, also buttons for the front shoulder buttons on a PlayStation controller. On the side here, you're able to access, again, the L1 and R1 as well as L2 and R2. Now, this is meant to emulate an original PlayStation controller, so it's not worried about dual analog sticks, it's only worried about the D-pad. And the way it simulates that is this little swivel hinge right here. So based on how you actually move your hand while you're wearing the grip, that's doing the D-pad. Now, I wasn't actually able to find too much information on these. The only thing I could find for the PlayStation version is a single archived article written back when this was first shown off at E3. What year, I'm not quite sure. And the information there is somewhat helpful, but still leaves a few gray areas in its design. For instance, this button right here is actually designed to access some configuration options, like being able to invert the D-pad for certain games, like if you want down to be up and up to be down, usually useful things like flight simulators, as well as sensitivity options for the swivel. That's all the article says. It doesn't actually say how it works or what buttons you use in conjunction with it, so not really sure how to wield it specifically, but that is what that button's for. Now, on the underside of the grip is a little switch with three little letters, and what that stands for is digital, analog, or simulated analog. And what that means is it's changing the way that the movement on the wrist right here, how it's read by the system, whether it's being read as a digital control, which is the standard on PlayStation controllers, or being read as an analog input for more precise control. As for what this controller was actually designed for, well, that's not quite as clear. In the one single article I was able to find, there was some talking with the reps behind it, discussing what kind of games it would necessarily be better for, and a lot of that lines up with the kind of logic we've used before with other weird controllers. For instance, racing games are pretty easy because you only have to worry about hitting one of two buttons, accelerate or brake, and then you can turn by just moving the controller left and right. That's all you got to worry about. On the other hand, something that's more advanced or crazy like an action game or a sports title, this is going to be a bit more of a nightmare. One of the interesting things to me that stood out, though, was the argument that this would work well for fighting games, which I'm not really sold on. Just imagining having to do things like double tap the D-pad sounds like a nightmare because you're just very quickly doing this, and that just seems more annoying than useful. And not to mention keeping track of where your fingers are on which buttons and trying to input combos. So it's not really clear if this was meant to give you any kind of advantage in a particular game. My best guess is that the lead benefit of this is for situations where you only really have great use of your right hand. It's something that would be really useful for anyone with kind of a handicap issue where you're only worrying about using one hand to control it. If you need to use your left hand, not so much, but if you have a good right hand, this would give you a way to control with only one hand in a way that's a little more feasible than past one-handed controller options we've looked at. I think it's also worth noting that something the article didn't talk about is that it would be a really good fit for an RPG, something like an old school Final Fantasy game, because in that case, you're not really worried about complex inputs at all, you're just wearing the glove and doing movements you need to select different menu options, giving you a free hand to, I don't know, play a cell phone game at the same time or something. It's a bizarre sell. After getting the Reality Quest and messing around with it a little bit, we realized it's kind of important to have a Power Glove to talk about the history of this entire design style.
I love the Power Glove.
And surprisingly enough, we actually haven't picked up a Power Glove yet. So in fact, today, we actually went out and hunted one down. My local game store that I normally go to didn't have any in stock since it was so short notice, but he actually recommended me another guy in the area at a store called 1UP Games where we were able to find one complete in the box to check out, and we actually have it right here, which is in awesome condition. So the Power Glove compared to the Reality Quest is really interesting, because in a lot of ways it was much more ambitious in terms of how it worked. Now, of course, you do have just the regular controls up top of the controller here, kind of like the Reality Quest has with where your fingers go. You have access to a D-pad, A and B, start and select, so on and so forth. But where it gets weirder is the programming buttons up top right here. So with these, you could do things like just having a turbo function or changing how things are read, but you could also do actual full programmable macros, which was weird for its time. What's really intense about the Power Glove, though, is how it handled all of its motion controls, and there were two ways it did this. The first is by having fiber optic wires running through 4 of the 5 fingers. It didn't have one in the pinky because for a lot of people it's really hard to move that independently without also moving the ring finger. It just relied on these 4 instead. And it ran fiber optic cables in each of them where, based on how much you were closing your fist with that finger, different light would travel through it. And that would make it read one of 4 positions, either being completely open, being closed all the way, or 2 midpoints. The other way it would work is with these pair of sound emitters right here at the top of the glove. So these would actually send out an ultra high frequency sound that people can't hear and do it as beeps that would then respond to 3 microphones that you would place around your TV. Now the way this worked is that the microphones would pick up the sounds and it would figure out, based on the time traveling distance between them, it could figure out the relative location of the glove. So we're gonna set up the Power Glove, and we realized that since all of its sensors and such are based on its own attachments and it's not relying on something like using a CRT like the light gun would, we could just use it on a modern system. So we actually brought out the analog to hook up to a modern TV and play with the Power Glove.
It's so bad.
Look, a lot of the stuff going into this glove was pretty expensive for its time, and so in order to save money and cut down on costs to make it more cheaply available to consumers, they cut around a lot of corners, and as a result, it didn't really work as well as it was meant to. The tech was there for things like the motion controls and moving of the fingers, but none of it was exact enough to really give you a real sense of good control. It also doesn't help that while they cut costs, it was still pretty expensive. This was $100 for its time, and to top it off, it was just for this by itself. None of the games that were specifically designed for the Power Glove, of which there are only 2, by the way, were included with this. So if you wanted to actually have a game that made use of it in an interesting way, well, you had to buy that separately. It's really interesting to think about the fact that this even was able to hit the market with the problems it had, when at the time, Nintendo was very controlling about the concept of quality assurance with any kind of product connected to their system. Now, to be clear, this was not made by Nintendo. Nintendo's name is attached, but it was actually developed and produced by Mattel in the US. And that's part of why it was rushed so quickly, because they wanted to get it to market as quickly as possible. The result of this rush production made the Power Glove something that, while very cool in concept, was just considered a terrible controller, and it didn't do very well after the initial response. However, it doesn't change the fact that it ended up having a pretty important part in pop culture. I mean, again, just the concept of a controller you could wear in your hand was really cool, and it doesn't hurt that at the time it was being pushed as many different ways as possible, including having a featured part in the movie The Wizard.
What is that?
Fire from the gods.
I don't know. Power Glove.
It's no surprise then that a controller that had such an ambitious idea of how to do virtual reality controls back in that day didn't really continue on in the future, and why, in the case of the Reality Quest, while it's still approaching this concept of controls with your hands, it's a much simpler mechanism. On that note, let's actually get back to the Reality Quest and try it on some games. So we have the Reality Quest all hooked up, and while we could just play it on a regular PlayStation to try it out the way it was meant to be, we decided to make it a little weirder and broke out the same adapter we used on another weird controller so we can play this on our PS4. Whether or not it's going to work great, I have no idea. I've made sure that it at least reads that I'm hitting buttons and stuff, but I haven't tried playing any games yet. So to start, we're gonna go with what was recommended back in that old article by playing a racing game, something that's pretty simple where we just have to worry about going forward and turning. So, moving the glove around left and right is working for selecting stuff on the menu. I do have it on simulated analog right now. Let's go ahead and just do a single offline race and see what happens. I can already tell there's already a little bit of drift with this though, because the menu is freaking out if I was just like a little bit too much this way. It's pretty sensitive. That might be adjustments I can make with this button right here, like I read earlier, but I don't actually know what the inputs are to make those adjustments, so. Okay, so when you change it to the other settings, it looks like it actually changes what everything else gets read as well. When you go to full analog, this now acts as a D-pad. At least that's what it seems like. Single race. Let's try this again with remapped controls. So something about the way this is programmed is that when you go into the other modes for the way the stick is read, or the D-pad in this case, it also changes the configuration of all the other buttons. I don't know if that's who had this glove prior was able to program those a certain way, which I don't know how because the instructions are lost to time. So what I'm doing instead is I'm changing the in-game controls to make it so that D-pad is used for steering and X is used for acceleration, because when I'm in regular D-pad mode, every button seems to work as intended. So we will do that. Okay, so one more time. I've had to redo this a couple times because when I'm changing modes, it seems to also mess with the button configurations of what button acts as what. And I never seem to be able to have both the option to steer and accelerate at the same time in a given mode. The only one that seems to be lining up with what button should be what is the regular digital mode. So what I'm gonna do is I've changed the settings in game to treat D-pad for steering, which should still be this motion here, and then X and circle for accelerating and braking. That should fix all of our problems. Let's see. It works! Yes! Okay. Okay, this isn't too bad now. Now that buttons work as intended. I certainly can't do any fancier moves right now, because I don't remember what any other button is mapped to, but for right now, I can accelerate and go forward. And turn. It's a success. I gotta say, there is something vaguely intuitive about this control scheme, but at the same time, I can already tell that constantly moving my wrist like this is just gonna get painful. Like there's no, this is already annoying me. Yeah, that's how you get carpal tunnel right there. If you want carpal tunnel, get this controller. So most of my time was spent just trying to figure out how to get the controls mapped just right to use an old PS1 controller on a PS4 game, but in the end, yes, I can play a game with this. It's just not a great idea. All right, so we've loaded up Soul Calibur and let's see how this goes. I can't imagine this being a good idea, actually. All right, this isn't too bad. Double tapping's definitely annoying. I gotta say, I think the biggest problem with this controller is that it's a little more intuitive than you would think. I still wouldn't recommend it for anything with complex button inputs, but if you can get the right just few buttons down, it really isn't that bad. The biggest problem is as you keep playing, you're just going to hurt your wrist. It's unavoidable. The entire way this works is by just constantly flexing this around, and that's not good. Like, you should not do this. Like, if you play any game for more than 10, 15 minutes, this is, which I'm doing right now, it's not a good feeling. I already want to stop shooting this. And hey, guess what? It disconnected, so there's a sign right there. The concept of a gloved controller is still something we think about today, and a lot of it comes from the idea of eventually, when VR is at its most refined, well, having a full controller that's just having a hand in a virtual realm makes a lot of sense. But historically, trying to do that before the tech was really here definitely had its problems, whether that's the Power Glove's lack of refined control or the Virtual Quest's very uncomfortable reliance on moving your wrist around like a madman. There's a reason stuff like this just didn't work out at the end, but they were necessary stepping stones to establish where we're going in the future with more controllers. The standard gamepad is still the main way to play games, but as we get further and further in tech, we might see something like this be a more direct ancestor.